A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. So Daniel sent us this one, and it's a meaty one. He's asking about the agentic AI framework explosion. There are now more than a dozen major open source options: LangGraph, CrewAI, AutoGen, OpenAI Agents SDK, Google ADK, Pydantic AI, small agents, the list goes on. And yet, despite all that abundance, a significant chunk of serious developers are actively avoiding frameworks altogether. Daniel wants to know, what patterns are we actually seeing in enterprise adoption? And why do frameworks sometimes not even enter the conversation for certain organizations? So, where do we start with this?
The abundance question is actually the right place to start because it's a bit of a trap. When you see 12 plus frameworks competing for attention, the instinct is to think this space is maturing, pick the best one. But what's actually happening is closer to what Janikiram MSV at the New Stack described back in February. He called it a direct replay of the 2015 container orchestration wars. Docker Swarm, Mesos, Kubernetes, all fighting for the same territory.
And Kubernetes won that one pretty decisively.
It did. But here's the twist that makes the agent framework situation fundamentally different. In 2015, containers didn't get better at orchestrating themselves. You always needed a scheduler. The orchestration layer had durable value. With agent frameworks, the models themselves are getting better at orchestration with every generation. So, the independent framework layer is being squeezed from below by the models and from above by the hyperscalers.
That's a genuinely uncomfortable position to be in if you're, say, the LangGraph team.
It really is. And the hyperscaler angle is where it gets strategically interesting. AWS released Strands agents. Google has ADK, which is native to Gemini and Vertex AI. Microsoft has their agent framework pointing at Azure Foundry. These are all open source, free to use. And the framing from Janikiram is sharp. This is the GKE, EKS, AKS playbook applied to agents. Give away the orchestrator, monetize the infrastructure underneath.
So the framework is a loss leader.
The framework is a loss leader. And if you build your agentic workflow on AWS's Bedrock Agent Core, for example, you're not just using a runtime, you're embedding your agent architecture into AWS's governance, observability, and billing stack in ways that compound over time and become increasingly difficult to unwind. Agentic lock-in is actually more durable than API lock-in because it accumulates at multiple layers simultaneously: the foundation model, the orchestration framework, the runtime environment, and the developer patterns your team internalizes.
By the way, today's episode is brought to you by Claude Sonnet 4.6, which is generating our script. And yes, I see the irony of an AI writing the section where we discuss how Anthropic tells you not to use frameworks.
Which is the most delicious irony in this entire space, and we have to address it directly. Anthropic's own engineering team published Building Effective Agents in December 2024, and the core thesis is basically, don't reach for a framework. Their exact framing was that the most successful implementations they'd seen weren't using complex frameworks or specialized libraries. They were building with simple, composable patterns directly against LLM APIs. And then they note, I'm paraphrasing, that if you do use a framework, make sure you understand the underlying code because incorrect assumptions about what's under the hood are a common source of errors.
So Anthropic's official engineering advice is, maybe don't use a framework. And Anthropic has a Claude Agent SDK.
They do. And look, I don't think that's actually hypocritical. I think it reflects a genuine tension. Frameworks are useful for getting started. They reduce boilerplate, they give you patterns to follow, they're great for demos and prototypes. The problem is the path from framework-assisted prototype to production-grade system is often where they become a liability rather than an asset.
Which brings us to the adoption numbers, because they tell a pretty interesting story.
They do, and the numbers are all over the place in a way that's revealing. McKinsey found 39% of organizations are experimenting with agents, but only 23% have begun scaling within even one business function. Gartner, in January 2025, said 61% had begun agentic AI development, but the same report predicts 40% of agentic AI deployments will be canceled by 2027 due to rising costs, unclear value, or poor risk controls.
40% cancellation rate predicted before they even fully launch. That's a brutal forecast.
And it's not coming from pessimists. Gartner is generally pretty bullish on enterprise tech adoption. The JetBrains AI Pulse survey from January 2026, which covered 11,000 developers, found 90% use AI at work. 66% of companies plan to adopt coding agents within 12 months. But only 13% report using AI across the full software development lifecycle. There's a massive gap between we're experimenting and this is integrated into how we actually ship software.
JetBrains VP Oleg Koversnev made a comparison that stuck with me when I was reading about this. He's warning that AI agents are about to repeat the cloud ROI crisis.
That framing is really useful. When enterprises moved to the cloud, the first wave was enthusiasm and investment, followed quickly by, wait, where did all this money go and what did we get for it? An entire category of cloud cost management and FinOps tooling emerged from that pressure. Koversnev is saying the same dynamic is already starting with agents. One developer can spend $100 a month on API calls. A team orchestrating thousands of agents can spend $100,000. Without governance, those costs compound invisibly and the ROI conversation becomes very uncomfortable very fast.
And the MIT research on this is genuinely sobering. 95% of enterprise AI pilots fail to scale. Only 5% deliver measurable profit impact. The constraint isn't model capability, it's operational fit.
Which is the key insight that gets lost in all the framework hype. The problem most enterprises face isn't our model isn't smart enough, or we picked the wrong framework. It's that the organizational infrastructure required to deploy agents reliably, documentation, domain models, escalation policies, testing pipelines, governance structures, doesn't exist yet. AWS's Matthias Patsak put it really directly in January. Agents can't work across teams because they lack the domain knowledge that exists only in developers' minds. Architectural patterns, business rules, design constraints, that knowledge isn't written down anywhere. When agents try to make changes to another team's code, they usually fail because they're operating without that context.
So it's a people and process problem wearing a technology costume.
The DORA 2025 report adds another dimension. About 77% of organizations deploy once per day or less. Manual testing and deployment pipelines simply cannot handle the volume of agent-generated code. So even if your agents are producing good output, your delivery infrastructure isn't set up to absorb it.
Now I want to get into the category of organizations where frameworks aren't even part of the conversation, because I think this is the most underappreciated part of the story. What are we actually talking about here?
There are several distinct categories, and they're worth separating because the reasons are different. The first and most immediate is security and compliance. A recent Gravity report found 88% of organizations had experienced confirmed or suspected agent security incidents, and yet only 14% had full security approval for their agent fleet. Those two numbers together are alarming.
88% have had incidents, but only 14% have proper security approval. So most organizations are running agents that haven't been properly vetted, getting burned, and presumably doing it anyway.
The ones that have the luxury of doing it anyway. Regulated industries don't. Healthcare, finance, defense, government, they can't deploy frameworks that haven't passed security review, and most frameworks carry no compliance certifications. HIPAA, SOC 2, DORA, the EU AI Act, of the major frameworks, ACA is essentially the only one that holds multiple compliance certifications. So for a hospital system or a bank, the question isn't LangGraph or CrewAI, the question is, can we legally deploy this at all, and under what conditions?
And the EU AI Act is now in enforcement. That changed the calculus significantly for European enterprises.
August 2025 was when enforcement began, and the obligations are real. Transparency requirements, governance documentation, oversight mechanisms. And it applies to any AI deployed in EU markets, regardless of where the company is headquartered. So an American company selling into Europe has to comply. And for something like DeepSeek, which has been explicitly ruled out for any enterprise with EU operations and GDPR obligations regardless of its technical capabilities, the geopolitical dimension of where your data is processed becomes a hard constraint, not a preference.
There's a related category here that's even more extreme. Air-gapped environments, defense, intelligence, critical infrastructure. Cloud-dependent frameworks are simply impossible.
Right. And this is a case where the framework conversation never starts because the technical prerequisites don't exist. Most of these frameworks assume connectivity. They're pulling from cloud-hosted models, they're logging to remote observability platforms, they're calling external APIs. For an air-gapped environment, you need a fundamentally different architecture, and most of the mainstream frameworks aren't designed for it.
Let's talk about the vendor lock-in angle more specifically, because Kai Weiner's Enterprise Agentic AI Landscape from earlier this month frames this in a way I found really useful: the trust versus lock-in matrix.
The key insight from that analysis is that choosing an agentic AI vendor in 2026 is categorically different from choosing an API vendor. It's a strategic partnership decision. Because the lock-in isn't just at the API layer, it's at the framework layer, the runtime layer, the observability layer, and the developer pattern layer. When your team has internalized how to build agents in a particular framework, that's organizational lock-in that doesn't show up in a contract but is very real.
And the hyperscalers understand this perfectly. They're not giving away frameworks out of generosity.
The Cengage CIO Ken Grady put it well. Vendors are working at cross purposes as they seek to compete and protect their data moats. And the practical consequence is that APIs for one vendor's platform don't interoperate with those of another vendor's platform. You can't easily take an agent architecture built on Bedrock Agent Core and migrate it to Azure Foundry. The switching costs accumulate in ways that aren't obvious up front.
Now I want to get into the no framework camp more directly, because there's a principled engineering argument here that's worth taking seriously. Isaac Hagewell at Atlassian spent 8 months shipping AI features in production, and his conclusions were pretty blunt.
His piece on DEV-Dub2 from August 2025 is worth reading in full. The core argument is that agents sound compelling on conference slides, but in production they break, drift, and stall unless you're babysitting every step. And he identifies a specific set of failure modes that aren't edge cases. They're the common case: loss of control, premature exit from tasks, performance degrading as instructions and tools and history grow, hallucinated actions, cascading errors with no robust recovery, poor context management over long tasks, and fundamental opacity that makes debugging miserable.
The one that gets me is true autonomy almost never survives outside of narrow, simple demos, because that's such a specific and damning claim from someone who's actually shipped this stuff.
And it aligns with the MIT finding. Most agent demos are meticulously iterated until they perform a single showcase scenario perfectly. The team has tuned the prompts, the tools, the context, everything is optimized for that specific flow. What's hard and still largely unsolved is getting robust, reliable performance in the messy, unpredictable real world where users don't follow the happy path.
So Hagewell's prescription is basically use LLMs as tightly scoped components, not orchestrators. Schema-enforced outputs, explicit branching logic, no agentic autonomy.
Code first, workflow based. And his critique of frameworks is that most of them push you toward agentic complexity even when simpler procedural logic would work better. The framework's design philosophy shapes what you build, and if the framework is optimized for multi-agent orchestration, you tend to reach for multi-agent orchestration even when a deterministic function call would be more reliable and easier to debug.
There's something almost ironic about that. You adopt a framework to reduce complexity, and the framework's abstractions push you toward a more complex architecture than you would have built from scratch.
Which is exactly what the AWS Strands team found when they built their own thin framework. Their explicit reasoning was that they'd realized they no longer needed complex orchestration because models now have native tool use and reasoning capabilities. Their previous framework libraries were getting in the way of fully leveraging what newer LLMs could do on their own. The framework was designed for a world where models needed heavy scaffolding, and that world is changing rapidly.
This connects to the smarter models, thinner frameworks trend. Let's spend a minute on this because I think it's the structural shift that most commentary misses.
It's the most important underlying dynamic. With models at the capability level of Claude Sonnet 4.6, Gemini 3 Pro, Llama 4 Scout, which has a 10 million token context window, a lot of what frameworks were doing for you, the model can now do natively. Planning, tool selection, self-correction, handling ambiguity. The explicit control flow that LangGraph-style DAG orchestration provides was valuable when models were less capable. As model capability increases, the value of that explicit scaffolding decreases.
So independent frameworks are in a genuinely precarious position. The models are getting better at the thing frameworks were built to do, and the hyperscalers are commoditizing the deployment layer from the other direction.
And the question of what survives that squeeze is interesting. The new stacks analysis suggests the answer might not be a framework at all. It might be the protocol layer. MCP, the Model Context Protocol, which was donated to the Linux Foundation's Agentic AI Foundation, and A2A, Agent to Agent. These are becoming the unifying substrate in the way that TCP/IP unified networking without requiring everyone to use the same operating system.
The Kubernetes of agents might be a protocol, not a framework. That's a genuinely provocative thesis.
And historically, it's a pattern. The infrastructure wars often get resolved at the protocol layer rather than the application layer. The browser wars didn't end because one browser won permanently. They ended because HTML and HTTP became the shared substrate that browsers competed on top of. If MCP and A2A become the standard interoperability layer for agents, then the framework you build on top becomes a much less critical decision.
So what actually does have durable value in this landscape? Because I don't want to leave listeners with just frameworks are bad and everything is uncertain.
Fair. There are 4 areas that are emerging as real differentiators. The first is context engineering, and this is subtle but important. The Manus team, which built one of the more sophisticated agent systems, rebuilt their framework 4 times before getting context management right. The insight is that the performance bottleneck isn't orchestration logic, it's what the model sees at each step. Garbage context in, garbage outputs out. Getting that right is genuinely hard and genuinely valuable.
And that's independent of which framework you use, or whether you use one at all.
Completely independent. The second area is evaluation and observability. LangChain's real moat, as it turns out, isn't the chain abstraction, it's LangSmith, the tooling for measuring and evaluating agent performance. Tools like LangFuse, BrainTrust, Ragas are building in this space. The principle is simple. You cannot improve agents you cannot measure. And right now, most organizations deploying agents have very limited visibility into what those agents are actually doing.
Which connects back to the security incident numbers. 88% have had incidents. And part of why that number is so high is that organizations don't have the observability to catch problems early.
The third area is agent security as a discipline. Microsoft published that 80% of Fortune 500 companies have active agents, but most organizations still treat agents as extensions of human user accounts rather than as independent entities that require their own identities and access controls. That's a fundamental security architecture problem. Agents need their own identity, their own permission scopes, their own audit trails. That's not a framework feature, it's a security practice.
And the fourth area?
Interoperability protocols, which we've already discussed, but the practical implication is that enterprises betting on MCP and A2A compatibility today are potentially insulating themselves from the coming framework shakeout. If your agent architecture is built on open protocols rather than proprietary framework abstractions, you have more flexibility to swap out components as the landscape evolves.
Let me ask you a practical question. If you're a developer or an engineering leader listening to this, trying to figure out what to actually do, what does this all add up to?
The honest answer is, it depends heavily on your context, and anyone who gives you a universal prescription is oversimplifying. But there are a few clear signals. If you're in a regulated industry, start with the compliance and security question before the technology question. Most frameworks haven't done the compliance work. Figure out what you're actually allowed to deploy before you evaluate features.
And if you're not in a regulated industry,
If you're building something new, Anthropic's advice to start directly with the API is genuinely sound. Most of the patterns you need can be implemented in a few hundred lines of Python. The framework abstraction adds overhead in terms of debugging complexity, dependency management, and the risk of building on abstractions that may not survive the next generation of models. Start simple, add complexity only when you have a specific problem that justifies it.
and the vendor lock-in consideration?
Be explicit about it. The Kai-Wiener trust versus lock-in matrix is a useful forcing function. Before you adopt a framework, ask, what runtime does this framework assume? What observability does it push me toward? If I want to migrate away from this in 2 years, what does that cost? The hyperscaler frameworks are particularly worth scrutinizing here because the lock-in is by design.
The ROI question is probably the one that's going to dominate the next 12 to 18 months. Because the JetBrains warning about the cloud ROI crisis, that pattern feels very likely to repeat.
The global AI system integration and consulting market hit $11 billion in 2025 and is projected at $14 billion in 2026. That number tells you the implementation gap is real and expensive to close. Organizations are spending enormous amounts on consultants and integrators to bridge the distance between we have agents and our agents are delivering measurable business value. The ones that are going to come out ahead are the ones that are rigorous about measuring outcomes before scaling investment, not after.
I keep coming back to that 40% cancellation prediction, because that's not a fringe forecast. That's Gartner saying nearly half of current agentic AI projects won't make it to 2027. And I think the framework question is partly responsible for that. Organizations are picking frameworks and building complexity when they should be validating whether the use case is actually viable first.
The Klarna reversal is the most public example of that dynamic. They made a lot of noise about replacing human customer service with AI agents and then quietly walked it back as the real-world performance didn't match the demo performance. And Replic's catastrophic database wipe from an agent running amok. These aren't anomalies, they're warnings. The gap between what an agent can do in a controlled demo and what it reliably does in production with real users and real edge cases is still enormous.
Which brings us back to Hagwell's point. The hardest thing about agents isn't building them, it's keeping them from doing something catastrophic when they encounter a situation the demo never tested.
And frameworks don't solve that problem. They can give you structure, but they can't give you reliability. Reliability comes from understanding your system deeply enough to know its failure modes, having the observability to catch problems early, and having the humility to constrain agent autonomy to the scope where you've actually validated it works. That's a discipline, not a dependency.
Alright, I think that's the note to end on. The framework abundance is real. The framework adoption is more complicated than the hype suggests. And, for a significant portion of the organizations that matter most, regulated industries, enterprises with real governance requirements, teams that have actually shipped this stuff in production, the framework question is either unanswerable or the wrong question entirely.
And the organizations that are going to navigate this well are the ones that start with, what problem are we actually solving and how will we know if we've solved it, rather than which framework should we pick? The protocol layer, the observability tooling, the security practices, that's where the durable value is being built right now.
Big thanks to Modal for the GPU credits that keep this whole operation running. Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flemingtop. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you're enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app goes a long way toward helping new listeners find us. Take care.
See you next time.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth.